If you'd have asked me where my hype levels were at for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth this time last year, I would have probably said that I was gonna explode with excitement all over the place. But strangely enough, as the game got closer and closer to releasing, that excitement cooled a bit, and I ended up going into Rebirth with fairly mid-level expectations. Now, depending on your reaction to Final Fantasy VII Remake story and conclusion, you may have very different expectations for where Rebirth was going to end up. Broadly speaking, you had two main interpretations. One side believed that this remake trilogy was going to end up as a mostly faithful retelling of the Final Fantasy VII storyline, with a few added scenes to flesh out the meat and bones of that original story. Whereas the other side thought that we would be getting some massive changes to the core narrative, maybe altering things that have been central to Final Fantasy VII storyline in the past. I was in the second camp personally, as I felt that Remake was pretty on the nose about killing the concept of fate by having us kill the concept of fate, therefore laying the groundwork for the sequel to potentially completely change the core beats of the story. And I don't think it's a big stretch to have seen all the stuff at the end of Remake and think that Rebirth might be going to some crazy places. The problem is that remakes like this can't really serve people that want the old thing and others that want a new thing at the same time. At some point, you have to make someone unhappy. But before I get into my negatives, I think it's important to praise what Rebirth does right. Combat has been improved with some moveset changes to Cloud and other characters having smoother animations or new utilities altogether. The music is also such a stellar part of the experience, and I'm scared to know how many tracks are in this game because it feels like every theme got like 20 different renditions. It was also awe-inspiring to see the scale of some locations in an open area setting. Exploring the outskirts of Junon and seeing that gigantic cannon hanging over the area was a spectacle in itself. There are also so many little touches and implementations here that make the world feel lived in and give the players something new to do every so often. Card games, side quests, pianos, and a whole host of other minigames are on offer that end up making Rebirth a much more varied experience than Remake, which I am personally very thankful for. Unfortunately, I was a little disappointed by how reserved of a game Rebirth was in terms of embracing the crazy potential that Remake had set up. And since we are now in the wider world of Final Fantasy VII, we see so many new characters, some even making a return from the compilation and the mobile games. And while their inclusion is very cool, I think Rebirth struggles with trying to appease fans that want that classic experience remade, while also giving new elements for everyone to enjoy at the same time. So I don't think Rebirth is in itself underwhelming. The problem lies more in expectation, I think. Remake had us kill fate. The back of Rebirth's box says defy destiny together. To me, it just seems weirdly disingenuous on the part of Square Enix to blue ball everyone into not being sure what they're actually getting, because I don't think we defied much destiny in this game. It actually seems pretty destined to me. So when the credits rolled and the ending hit, I was confused. I'll be honest. When I put my controller down after beating Rebirth, I was annoyed. I was frustrated that Rebirth ultimately felt so straightforward in its story, while leaving all the crazy stuff for the very end, but handling it all in the messiest way that I haven't seen since, well, I guess since Remake's ending. At this point, I don't think I really care to partake in FF7 discussion until the final part in this trilogy comes out. I don't want to set up expectations for myself or think too hard about what the game is trying to say at this moment in time. Rebirth is a good time though, so I'm glad I got it out the way before any spoilers came across my corner of the internet. Oh, Dragon's Dogma. We've got a bit of a history on this channel with this series, and up until now, I haven't really had a reason to talk about it again in any real capacity. Dragon's Dogma 2 is a sequel 12 years in the making that was undeniably on my radar since its announcement. I tried to stay away from the marketing and the trailers to be as surprised as humanly possible when I started the game up, and I can now say that I'm a bit confused. Dragon's Dogma 2 is a bit of a weird sequel in a couple ways. It's not really continuing the story of the first game directly, though the nature of cycles and destined heroes is still very much a core part of what's going on. And in terms of the core ideas of Dragon's Dogma, 2 isn't really shattering those concepts either. Most of what is in the first game is also in the second game and vice versa. Most of the enemies are the same, there are only a handful of brand new bosses to fight, and pawns still have a problem with being a little too talkative. The feel of the gameplay has been massively improved though, and that cannot be understated. Movement has a heft to it now that makes each step you take feel a little more important, especially in boss fights where positioning is key to make the most of stronger attacks that need a moment to charge up. And pawns can do neat things now, like catch you when you're about to fall to your death, and they still have the behaviors from the first game that make each of them feel unique. Dragon's Dogma 2 also shares the same ye olde English speak that made up many of the first game's iconic catchphrases. Though here I have to admit I can't think of anything nearly as catchy as "The master works all, you can't go wrong." In fact, Dragon's Dogma 2 feels like a strange retread of what the first game set out to do, rather than a wholly fresh title in and of itself. In a lot of ways, it feels like the game that Itsuno and co. wanted to make all along, but little blemishes on an experience usually give it the seasoning that keeps the flavor in people's minds for longer, which is why I think Dragon's Dogma 1 has such a passionate following, and is kind of why I think I slightly prefer it overall. Instead of striking out in its own direction, Dragon's Dogma 2 feels like it wants to stay firmly in the first game's lane, smoothing out the rougher edges while keeping the soul of the experience alive. It unfortunately didn't resonate with me as much as the first game did, even though there are definite improvements here. I don't know, I just feel like the first game was incredibly fun and quirky, and if there was ever going to be a sequel, I had hoped that it would try to be something really different so it could stand on its own more. Like, quests are, for the most part, simple fetch or escort missions, with some that, in fairness, do offer unique storylines too. It's not just one thing or the other. Vocations also have their own share of good and questionable decisions. I don't like how Strider has now been split up into 2 classes, because the feeling of pairing a bow and daggers just felt so good. And sure, the Wayfarer kind of makes up for that, but I don't know, I kind of prefer how the first game handled hybrid vocations a little better. That being said, the Mystic Spearhand is the coolest thing I've ever seen in an action RPG, so I'm going to need this vocation to get some more abilities if an expansion ever comes around. Shit has never made me feel cooler than when I'm spinning this thing on a dragon's back. 10 out of 10, would recommend.
Behold the ultimate power!
Nightrunners is the kind of game you get when you envision the chillest vibes in the racing genre, cradled by the aesthetics of the PS2. A game so delightfully melancholic with its atmosphere, so deliciously decisive in presentation, and I cannot get enough of it. As of now, it's in a prologue state with updates streaming in every few weeks, and it's completely free to download at this moment. Hi, this is actually editing Sam here. So the demo will actually only be up for another month or so because the game actually managed to reach its Kickstarter goal. So you have about a month from the publishing date of this video to play Nightrunners Prologue before the game releases sometime in the future. Be sure to follow Nightrunners on Twitter to get all of the information you need. Yeah, back to the video. Set on the streets of Japan, I'm not sure where exactly, and I can't remember if the game says it outright, and in the early hours of the morning. Nightrunners has you racing down the highways with fellow Insomniac racers with cars that invoke the slender yet blocky style of the early 90s. I'm not exactly a car guy, so I can't get into the nitty-gritty of what the game can expect from you in terms of in-depth car knowledge. My brain understands acceleration, top speed, braking, and from there, it gets murky. I mainly grew up with Burnout, if you can't already tell, so if you start talking about wind currents and torque, I'm already gone, I'm afraid. I'm done. But what I can definitively discuss is Nightrunners' vibe, and that's heavily borrowed from PS2 races like Need for Speed Underground series, and more similarly, I'd say Tokyo Extreme Racer 3. Those games instilled how chill driving down an empty highway guided only by the fading streetlights and faint shapes of cars ahead of you could be. And sure, actually racing other drivers was a massive part of the game, but most of my time here would instead be spent on simply cruising around the streets. Aesthetically, Nightrunners borrows from these games faithfully by keeping the visuals fairly low-key. Streets are dimly lit, contrasted by the tunnels that overwhelm the senses with bright surgical light and choking the sound of the engine. There's no abundance of neon to be seen, nothing that outright screams, "Hey guys, do you remember what games in 2004 were like?" But that reserved approach goes out the window with the 4:3 ratio and intense CRT effects used in some menus and scenes. It's a really intriguing approach stylistically to jump back and forth between low-key PS2 goodness and sudden nostalgia overload, but it all works so well. Throw in a soundtrack made up of electronica that invokes hints of euphoric sadness combined with intense beats made by some of the best artists on the scene, and yeah, I'm blown away. I'm bound to dip my toes back into Nightrunners whenever the mood calls for it, because it's the kind of game you can enjoy at 3 AM wondering why your life went so wrong, and you can do all this without even having to own a car. So that's great. In keeping with the vibe of where this video has gone, I ended up jumping into the original Yakuza this last week. Now, my history with Yakuza is pretty funny because I remember playing the demo disc I got with the official PlayStation magazine back in 2006, and being terrified by the game's opening. But as soon as the first fight begins, accompanied by Funk Goes On, I was locked in and smashing guys with a chair with a smile on my face. I never ended up getting Yakuza back then, and wouldn't actually get into the series until 2018 when I played Kiwami for the first time. That's right, I played Zero after Kiwami. I'm one of those sick freaks. But as good as Kiwami is, it's hard for that game to stand on its own when its presentation is made up of the modern Yakuza visuals for the time, but with cutscenes that are one-to-one animated and shot like the PS2 original. It's obviously intended to be an authentic remake, but to me, it comes across as a little stilted. Now, if you travel back in time to 2005, this game makes a lot more sense. We're traveling to a time period where Yakuza is only just beginning and has an English dub, which is so funny to listen to. And you can probably guess that I think this is the best way to experience this game. For a start, the visuals of Kamurocho are unlike anything this series has brought to the table. I love how the Dragon Engine looks, but man, you cannot beat that blurry, hazy look of the town here. Yakuza also employs a fixed camera angle as Kiryu walks around the town, and it made me appreciate the scale of this place so much more than I have before, especially when Kiryu is far away from the camera and then you get to see the whole street in this one shot. The hazier visuals also make Kamurocho feel a lot grimmer than they do in future games, which fits well with the fact that Yakuza doesn't really mess around as much as some of the other games do nowadays. Sub-stories still have plenty of humor, and you can still find some hilarious stuff on the side like always, but it feels a lot more subdued in this version. I was kind of blown away by how much stuff Yakuza has too. We've got mini-games, hostess bars, claw machines, and a Don Quixote with the classic song too, which I only recently found out was a real thing. It's just a shame that traveling around Kamurocho can feel a little bit sluggish. Kiryu's chunky run cycle only gets him across the town at a fairly slow pace, and throw in enemy encounters that are hard to miss without already knowing that a guy is going to jump you, and yeah, it can be rough to walk around the streets. The combat is admittedly pretty rough too. For the most part, you can just spam the same combo again and again. Actually, that's what I tend to do anyway for most of the games, so never mind, disregard that. It's actually great combat. The only real problem is how stiff Kiryu can be. Once he's throwing out punches, it can be hard to redirect him if an enemy decides to step out the way. But this is a problem that's immediately rectified by Yakuza 2, so it's something I can very easily live with in this game. I also cannot forget to mention the dub, which is hilarious, but also surprising. Michael Madsen as Shimano is casting I did not expect, but it does work. I also have a soft spot for Daryl Carrillo's portrayal of Kiryu in this game. It fits in really well alongside Takaya Kuroda's portrayal since they both sound like guys who could beat you up and then sing you back to health. I'm really glad I finally got around to playing this version of the game after going through all of the other ones over the years. Kind of annoyed at the same time though because I wish I started with this game instead of Kiwami. Not to say that Kiwami is a bad version of this game, but some of its additions end up bloating the story in a way that's more distracting than anything else, unfortunately. So yeah, if you've never played the original Yakuza, then go solve that as soon as you can. I know emulating it was a problem for a while, but as far as I know, there are ways to massively improve that experience now. I played this on a real PS2 though, like the real gamer I am, and loved every second of it. Except for that crash that caused me to lose an hour of progress. That, yeah, that one stung.